One of the things I think we have to be really careful about as Christians is our misrepresentation of the Jewish religion in the New Testament. The New Testament is a contextual document that is written in the decades after Jesus' death, and it has Jesus interacting with various different ideological, philosophical, and religious groupings of people. One of the primary ones that Jesus interacts with is the Pharisees. Now, one of the things that we come away with sometimes in reading the New Testament is that Jesus and the Pharisees are opposite sides of the spectrum. Well, first of all, that's not true. Jesus is actually very close to the Pharisees on a lot of ideas, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. But second, you have to understand that the Gospels primarily are being written later in the first century. And one of the big historical things that happens in 70 AD is the destruction of the Jewish temple. Well, when that happens, the group called the Sadducees are largely irrelevant now. The Zealots are largely wiped out, and the Essenes sort of head off into the desert. And the only major group that's left as a viable alternative within Judaism to this early Christian movement are the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees go on to become the rabbinical movement. The Pharisees are where, the rabbi down the street from you is going to draw their lineage from. And so it's really important that we understand the Gospels are contrasting Jesus and Pharisees, not because they're opposite ends of the spectrum, but because, in some ways, when the Gospels are written, those are the two groups vying for religious attention from the prospective audience. And so the contrast is being drawn to draw people into the Jesus story. That does not mean, though, that the Pharisees are, first of all, the primary antagonist of Jesus, or that we should caricature or mischaracterize their actual teachings.
We should start by diffusing some of our misconceptions about Pharisees. First of all, Pharisees had no formal power in Israel at the time of Jesus, so religious authority is a bit of a misnomer. Influence, sure, but power, not really. Maybe soft power, but no real hard authority here. For example, Pharisees could not impose legal restrictions on people. They could not force religious interpretations on anyone. In fact, the official religious authority in Jerusalem was a group called the Sadducees. And in John's gospel, the writer makes a very clear distinction between Pharisees and religious authorities on several different occasions. Second, we sometimes have this imagination that the Pharisees were harsh and therefore hated by the people, as opposed to Jesus, who was loved by all the common folk. The truth, however, is more nuanced. And the Pharisees were largely considered the liberals of the day, and that made them quite popular. For example, from inter-Testamental Jewish writings that we know of, the Pharisees were often the group that downplayed religious punishment and were most often criticized for being too lenient with religious penalty. Even some of the religious practices that they taught, at least originally, were seen as democratizing. For example, the Pharisees taught a very strict practice of hand washing before meals. Jesus gets into a debate with some of them in Mark 7 about this, with Jesus saying, look, this is good, but it's just a human tradition. Don't get so hung up on this. But the thing is, the reason people liked this specific teaching is because in Torah, Exodus 30 specifically, it tells us that priests have to wash their hands ceremonially. Well, the Pharisees come along later and they say, you know what? If priests have to do it, and Pharisees aren't priests, by the way, but if priests have to do it, I think we should all do it. Because we're all children of God. We all serve the same God in our own way. Your hands are just as holy as theirs. Now, I happen to think Jesus has a point. It's fine to create your own rituals as reminders of your devotion. Just don't elevate them to the kind of demand you hold over anyone else. But I also kind of get why people liked the Pharisees. Even in teaching this very strict hand-washing practice, they were saying, you are important. Just as important as them, in fact. So don't forget that. Remind yourself of that every time you eat. You are not less than simply because you were not born into a priestly family. I mean, that sounds pretty solid, am I right? In truth, this was actually one of the major critiques of the Pharisees from the period, is that they were challenging the dividing line between sacred and secular. They elevated the common people to the status of the religious elite by teaching that a lot of those practices were open and available to anyone. That was really the root of the Pharisaical tradition. We don't need the temple. We have God with us through Torah. And you can see why that becomes pretty popular. Now, with popularity comes influence, and with influence comes respect, and sometimes with respect can come arrogance. And with arrogance comes a detachment from those same people you started out wanting to serve, right? And I think this is why when Jesus comes along, sure, there are some Pharisees that oppose him, but there are also just as many, it seems, who are very intrigued by what he has to say. They keep inviting him into their homes, and in the end, some even choose to follow him, like Nicodemus. So those Pharisees certainly didn't see Jesus as a challenge to their ways. They saw him as a voice from within calling for ongoing, continual reform. This is why some scholars would argue that if you're going to try to put a label on Jesus, which doesn't really work very well, but if you were going to try, Pharisee is about as close as you're going to get in the first century. But this is also precisely why, when the question comes, why are you eating and drinking with sinners? Why are you provoking us by calling these people as your followers? Jesus responds by quoting the Pharisees, or at least a Pharisaically adjacent tradition. See, in the Makilta, with a rule of Rabbi Ishmael, we read this: if they're not sick, why would they need a doctor? In other words, when confronted by Pharisees, Jesus quotes sources he knows that Pharisees trust. Guys, remember why you got into this in the first place? It was to help people. That's my bag too. And I love that in this whole confrontation cycle, Jesus starts by going to what he appreciates most about his critics. He appeals to his common ground with them. And if you get nothing else out of today, just hold on to that. Sometimes, starting with what you hold in common with someone, looking for shared space intentionally, that can fix a fight before it even begins. And not always, because this confrontation spirals pretty quickly here, but Jesus' instinct is to go to common ground first. I think that's more than wise. I think it's holy. God looks for what God shares with you, and then God will work from there.
Hey, Jeremy here, and thank you for clicking through to watch that video. If you're intrigued by the work that we're doing here at Commons, you can, of course, hit subscribe to keep up to date with all of the content that we're posting here on YouTube. You can head to our website at commons.church, and you can find us on all of the socials at Commons Church. You can also join our Discord. There, the community is having all kinds of conversations about how we can encourage each other in the way of Jesus. Head to commons.church/Discord for the invite there. Also, leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you and all the ways that you are journeying on this path toward Jesus. But thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all the ways that you contribute to this conversation. Together, we'll see you soon.